So welcome to the fifth lecture in the Darwin College lecture series now in 2013, in which we have the overall theme of foresight. As you may know, the lectures are freely available on the university's streaming media service. Just follow the links from the Darwin College website. So far in this series, our speakers have covered foresight in ancient civilizations, in journalism, in science fiction, and the history of science. Today we turn to what some might regard as a paradoxical choice, given our general theme of foresight: music. How on earth can music involve foresight? Music soothes, music stirs, music enrages, music pacifies, but how can it be linked to foresight? I trained as a mathematician. Now, music, maths, and science are deeply intertwined, with all three descending in some way from Pythagoras. To quote Plato in the Republic, musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because music and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace. Is this not foresight? You can almost hear a cello playing Bach in those words. Music, this potent channel to wisdom, we search into ourselves even as we look forwards. Now, tonight we are very fortunate to have Nicholas Cook as our speaker. He, as you can see from the screen, is the 1684 Professor of Music here in Cambridge. And in case you're wondering, 1684 marks the founding of the Professorship of Music. The first holder was Nicholas Staggins, Master of the King's Music. Nicholas Cook is a Fellow of Darwin College. He's co-editor of the Cambridge History of 20th Century Music, author of 9 books and editor of more, as well as author of numerous articles. He's a noted authority on Beethoven, especially that wonderful Ninth Symphony, and he's completed a movement of Beethoven's unfinished 6th piano concerto. Music gives perspective far beyond the ordinary sight of humanity. Nicholas Cook, we much look forward to hearing your selections and your insight on foresight in music. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, when I was asked to give this lecture on music and foresight, I said yes, because one does, and then I wondered what on earth I was going to talk about. So I did the obvious thing, and I asked some of my musicologist friends what they would talk about in a lecture on music and foresight. And the second thing they all said was the same: Atali. The first thing they all said is they wouldn't do a lecture on music and foresight. Okay, and when they said Atali, they were talking about the French economist, politician, and founding president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Jacques Attali. Among the general public, Attali is best remembered for the circumstances surrounding his resignation from the bank, which included the £750,000 spent on replacing the red travertine marble in the lobby of the bank's brand new headquarters by a paler and, in his view, more aesthetically appropriate Carrera marble. But among musicologists, he's known for a book called Noise, The Political Economy of Music, which was originally published in 1977 and translated into English in 1985. And this brought a combination of economic theory and grand cultural speculation into a discipline that was just at that time opening itself to new influences under the influence of the so-called new musicologists. So, what did Jacques Attali have to say about the marble? Not a lot, but he was more forthcoming on music and foresight. Every major social rupture, he said, has been preceded by an essential mutation in the codes of music. Again, before the transition in political institutions from divine right to political representation, the rupture had already taken place in music. And this happened, he explains, because music is the audible waveband of the vibrations and signs that make up society. And more than that, Change is inscribed in noise faster than it transforms society, and for that reason, music is a herald of times to come. So a principal purpose of his book is to decipher the codes, and in that way reveal the prophecy announced by today's music of the potential for a new political and cultural order. And the order to which he refers is a distinctly utopian one. It's what, in a rather idiosyncratic usage, he calls the order of composition, in which music emerges as an activity that is an end in itself. In other words, he identifies a new turn towards musical participation and interprets it as adumbrating a broader social order that calls into question the distinction between worker and consumer, and hence calls into question the entire regime of monetary exchange. For Attali, composition embodies the emancipation of the individual as an autonomous agent. Noise was translated into English by no less a figure than Brian Masumi, and Frederick Jameson provided a foreword. And in his foreword, Jameson explained the originality of Attali's book through its inversion of the classic Marxist model, according to which the economic base is reflected in the cultural superstructure. As Jameson says, Attali is the first to have drawn the other possible logical consequence of the reciprocal interaction model, namely the possibility of a superstructure to anticipate historical developments, to foreshadow new social formations in a prophetic and annunciatory way. Well, that's a heady project, a heady prospect on the one hand, empowering the artist who may contribute to social change, and on the other, empowering the commentator who can read social change from musical practice. It also resonates with a small number of empirical observations I've been able to identify. Ariel Berg writes that independently introduced tapes of ultra-nationalistic Croatian music were on sale in stalls long before there was open war. And according to Donna Buchanan, performances and recordings by Bulgarian musicians during the 1980s functioned not only as prominent harbingers, but as agents of political transformation or transition. But in what way might Attali's approach provide a more general explanatory framework for such phenomena? Well, there's an obvious resonance between what Attali is saying and T.W. Adorno's idea that music has the capacity to express in the antinomies of its own formal language the exigencies of the social situation. It presents social problems through its own material and according to its own formal laws, problems which music contains within the innermost cells of its technique. It's this aspect of Adorno's approach that prompted the new musicologists, and especially Susan McClary, to attempt to decipher classical scores in terms of social meaning. For example, in her famous or infamous interpretation of the tonal drive of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as a symbolic expression of pathological misogyny. So is that the sort of thing Attali had in mind? But then, by the time the new musicologists had latched onto Adorno, sociologists had turned away from this kind of deciphering approach. As Howard Becker put it in a lecture he delivered to ethnomusicologists in 1989, sociologists aren't much interested in decoding artworks, in finding the work's secret meanings as reflections of a society. They prefer to see those works as the result of what a lot of people have done jointly. In other words, you don't understand social relationships by looking in musical scores, by poking your nose in them. You do it by seeing what people do in musical contexts, which is what Buchanan meant when she talked about Bulgarian musicians acting as agents of political transition. So is that then what Attali had in mind? In truth, it's hard to be sure which of those two he meant, or even whether he knew which he meant. Nor is it at all clear what sort of participatory music Attali was talking about. He speaks of it as having emerged over the previous 20 years, that's to say up to 1977, when the book first appeared in French. And as you might expect of a French intellectual of that period, he cites composers of the European avant-garde, such as Pierre Boulez, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and Luciano Berio. But they stood for an elite culture making unprecedented demand on technical skills, the opposite extreme from a participatory musical culture. Then he makes a few references to figures as disparate as John Cage, Jimi Hendrix, and the Rolling Stones. He also talks, and at rather more length, about the New York-based Jazz Composers Orchestra Association, and he quotes Malcolm X on free jazz. But what he says here doesn't inspire confidence. Alan Sandbridge speaks of Attali's cursory 2.5-page analysis of a music with which he seems barely familiar, making some rather curious errors, which Stanbridge then goes on to detail at length, and we don't want to go there. Other than that, there's just a distinctly vague reference to the number of small orchestras for amateurs who play for free, and whose numbers, Attali says, have mushroomed. Now, in the afterword that she contributed to the English version of Attali's book, so everybody was there, Susan McClary interpreted Attali's composition in terms of punk rock. And a number of subsequent commentators have followed her lead. Whether that's actually what Attali had in mind is quite a different matter. Apart from the fact that it doesn't actually mention punk, it was only in 1977, the year the book actually came out, that punk hit the headlines. That was the year when Sid Vicious joined the Sex Pistols and The Clash released their debut album. Recently, another more contemporary interpretation of Attali has emerged, but I'll come to that towards the end of this talk. Well, given these fairly fundamental problems, it's probably fair to say that Attali's book got an easier ride than it might because of the extent to which it silently builds on quite familiar thinking about music. The idea that music is a representation of society is part of the discourse of free jazz, but it goes back at least to the 18th century, when it was in particular associated with a string quartet. In 1777, the composer and critic Johann Reichhardt referred to the quartet as a conversation among four persons. But the most famous example is Goethe, who in 1829 described it as the most comprehensible type of instrumental music. One hears four reasonable people engaged in conversation with one another. And it's Goethe that the contemporary composer Brian Ferneyhough is echoing when he speaks of the old image of four civilized people talking to each other. If you take a page at random from the quartet literature, then you can see what is meant in the orderly succession of ideas passing from one instrument to another. A traditional musicological description, the sort of thing I was taught to do as an undergraduate, might consist of something like this. A 2-bar opening phrase moves from the tonic to the supertonic and is balanced by another 2-bar phrase that returns through the dominant to the tonic. This pair of matched 2-bar phrases leads in turn to a 4-bar phrase in which a distinct motif ascends from the viola through the second violin to the first violin, and so on and so forth. But a description like that misses the social dimension of the music. You get a much better idea of what is going on if you think not in terms of instruments, first violin, second violin, but rather of the people who are playing them, or at least of the musical roles that they're playing, in the same sense as in a role-playing game. And in a sense, that's what this kind of chamber music is. You can't play music like this unless everyone listens to everyone else. That's because there aren't precisely standardized values of timing, intonation, or dynamics that everybody is adhering to. People aren't just playing 1, 2, 3, 4 like a metronome. Instead, all of these things are negotiated between the players in real time. In this way, the music doesn't simply represent the ideal community that Reichhardt, Goethe, and Ferneyhough were talking about. It enacts it, it makes it present, it makes it audible, choreographs the formation of interpersonal relationships or the acting out of interpersonal roles for as long as the music lasts. So the idea of music as an embodiment of society is one established trope on which Attali was drawing. A second such trope is the idea that music, though ostensibly the most evanescent of cultural practices, somehow stands outside the temporality of the everyday world. Actually, this is a basic principle that has conditioned Western thinking about music for as long as you want to trace it back. In the early medieval period, the Platonic idea of earthly phenomena being copies of transcendent forms was adapted to music in a way that gave it enduring relevance to the Western art tradition. Sounds were seen as copies of entities whose primary form of existence was in written form. As Sam Barrett puts it, speaking of neumes, notation served not simply as a pragmatic aide-memoire, but as a reflexive tool for disciplined knowing, and more than that, it mirrors a higher order of being. And this idea has survived right up to the present day in the concept of music as a form of writing, or at least as an abstract entity that is embodied in or signified by writing. Seen this way, music is not sound, but rather something abstract that is realized through sound. And since sound is inherently temporal, a vibration is after all a relationship between intensity and time, this is as much to say that music is understood as something that is realized through time, but not in itself temporal. If Attali's idea that music can transcend time seems less bizarre than it really is, that's because of the ingrained sense that music was never quite contained within time in the first place. This second trope has taken many forms. Perhaps the closest to its origins in ancient Greek philosophy is its expression through shamanism, magical practices, and theories of divination. Speaking of the natural magic of the 16th century, Angela Voss writes that the key to the ordering of the cosmos, whether astronomically or musically, is number, and you can see the idea in this slightly later image. And Voss continues, number determines all things in nature and their concrete manifestation, together with all rhythms and cycles of life. Number revealed by the heavenly bodies unfolds as time. And this idea of music as something that is intrinsically timeless but unfolds as time also figures in the aesthetic idea of the musical work, an idea that can be traced back to the 16th century music theorist Nicolaus Listenius, but is generally seen as reaching its heyday around 1800. Expressing a similar intuition in 20th century terms is the psychoanalytical version of the trope, the idea of a timeless collective unconscious that music can translate into the time of experience. The general idea comes from Carl Jung, reflecting the influence of Schopenhauer, and it percolated into Anton Ehrenzweig's writing on music and on art more generally. And the present-day music aesthetician Peter Kivy draws a parallel with the venerable theological chestnut, as he calls it. How does God, who is eternal and unchanging, conceive of the course of history? The answer is that for God, past and present are laid out in a kind of augmented present. And Kivy links this with the idea of genius. Well, music theory draws on all of these. The fin de siècle Viennese music theorist Heinrich Schenker, whose theories ended up through a bizarre historical transformation as the foundation of post-war music theory in North America, gave concrete form to these tropes of number, metaphysics, and genius through an analytical method that might be characterized in terms of the notoriously inscrutable line that in Parsifal Wagner gives to Gurnemanz, here time turns to space. Music is laid out in an abstract spatial structure in two dimensions. This here is Schenker's sketch of Chopin's E major prelude, with what Schenker calls the background of the music at the bottom and the more detailed foreground, which is closer to the music we know at the top. So the vertical dimension is one of growth or differentiation. Meanwhile, the horizontal direction is translated into time in the act of performance. The term unfolding is part of Schenkerian jargon, and you could see the music as unfolding through time, rather like the unfurling of a scroll in which the future is already inscribed. There is, in short, a spatial metaphor that is deeply buried at the heart of thinking about music, that bears upon our basic sense of what kind of a thing music is, and that is consequently shared by Schenkers and practically every other analytical approach. It is, of course, the same metaphor that is built into the idea of foresight. The word for here exists, but it's little used, and some dictionaries gloss it as archaic. And then this idea that music always already exists and is just unfurled or unrolled through time reached its apogee through sound recording, which could be seen as the actualization of what aesthetics had posited only as an ideal. The 300-meter-long coiled groove of a 78 discs, that's how long it would be if you uncoiled it, this coiled groove was originally seen as a kind of script. In fact, that was the first argument advanced for bringing recordings within copyright. And as with any other script, this means that the end is already present from the beginning. There even used to be an audible sign of this predetermination in the pre-echo of badly engineered LPs, literally making the future audible, in fact, foreheard. But of course, the point is a broader one. For the last 50 years, there has been a widely shared view that the iterability and permanence of recordings has been reflected in a performance style that has become more and more predictable, more future-proofed, as it has converged upon a mechanical kind of perfection. Perfect, immaculate performance in the latest style preserves the work at the price of its definitive reification, Adorno wrote in 1938, and he continued, "It presents it as already complete from the very first note. The performance sounds like its own phonograph record." Seen one way then, the gramophone brought the concert experience into the domestic interior, created a particularly immersive sonic analogue of the novel. Seen more pessimistically, however, this could be seen as the subordination of personal experience to a manufactured reality in which aesthetic ideology and technology fuse into an idea of reproduction that neutralizes and rationalizes temporal becoming, channels it along predetermined paths, even as it creates an illusory sense of freedom. In short, music turns into an instrument of the administered society. That, of course, was Adorno's view, and it's here that the link between him and Attali is strongest. For Adorno, too, music might be seen as a rough sketch of the society under construction, and in the form of the recording, it becomes not just a reflection of the commodification of experience, but a mechanism for its realization. That's Adorno's general point about the culture industry, but it's perhaps best exemplified by Muzak, a term often used generically, but actually the trading name of the Muzak Corporation, or as it's now known, Muzak Holdings LLC. At one time, the company focused on the use of music for the rationalization of production, essentially as a mechanism for mood management. Nowadays, however, it focuses more on the engineering of consumption, in line with the transformation of advanced economies from a focus on manufacturing to one on service industries. Under such circumstances, borrowing Attali's broad brush, we might say that what 19th century music envisaged in the aesthetic domain was realized by the end of the 20th century in the social economy. The power of foresight, once ascribed to individual genius, has been rationalized and institutionalized in the form of the consultancy services that are marketed as an aid to corporate planning. Translating this back to Attali's terms, the suspicion is that we, Attali's community of self-directed individuals, are not so much the composers as the composed. There is perhaps